So we started last week a series on the Lord's Prayer, and one of the things that we're practicing together, and we're inviting everyone to practice, is praying the Lord's Prayer 3 times daily. And we didn't make this up. This is something that Jews and Christians have been doing for over 1,000 years, and so we're as a community practicing that and setting aside time in the morning, midday, evening to kind of have that regular rhythm of prayer. So yeah, how's that going for everybody? I know that it's one of those things that you can hear on Sunday and then kind of forget as the days go on. For me personally, I get about 3 lines in, and my mind starts to wander. Um, and part of that's my brain, but part of it is also um, this prayer that is so familiar. It's kind of this lullaby effect where you've heard it, 1,000,000 times, and so you kind of lose the meaning as you're saying it in your head, and you kind of have to bring to mind um, as you're praying, this is what this means. But I grew up in the Lutheran Church, and most of our prayers were liturgical, so they were written prayers that we said and followed. And really, if you were going to pray out loud or in a group, it was some sort of set prayer. And when I graduated college and I started going to a church that was more evangelical, I was just amazed that these people would just say prayers off the top of their head. That concept was just completely foreign to me. And so that was like a season of, learning a little bit more how to pray with people in ways that are more, top of mind, expressive, spontaneous. And so that was really influential on my prayer life and my heart, and I feel like I really benefited from that. But there's also just a lot that we can gain from these written prayers and prayers that have been, molded and crafted to point us towards God. And one of the prayers that I've been reading, and Mike can pull up this slide. It's from a book called Every Holy Moment, and it's a book of liturgies, and it's really just intended to have prayers for very mundane things like doing chores, going to work, and different events in your life. But within that book, there's morning, midday, and evening prayers of the hours. And this is the beginning of that prayer. So it's, O children of the living God, what is your Father's greatest desire for you this day? That we should love our eternal King with all our hearts, with all our souls, with all our minds, and with all our strength. And I have been doing this over the past month, and this prayer goes on and continues in similar language, but it was just like a great framing for me to go into my day. And it kind of goes beyond what is top of mind or in my head at that point. And so it's just really nice to have those prayers to kind of shape our own prayer life. My daughter and I were sketching the other day, and I'm like the best drawer of cows in our family. Like I can draw a really good cow. And so she says, Dad, can you show me how to do the cow? So I was like, okay, draw the head, and then she draws the head, here's the eyes, here's the horns. And so she does that, and then she says, well, I'm going to draw a really muscle cow, like a muscly cow. So she kind of goes off on her own and draws that, and I guess they had watched a movie with a minotaur that was just like a really strong cow. it didn't quite turn out the way that she wanted. And so she said, Dad, can you draw like a muscle cow for me? And so I drew one. It turned out pretty decent. And, and so she saw that, and then she was like, "Oh yeah, okay, all right, I'm gonna copy that." And then she said, "You know what? Actually, I'm gonna trace it." And I think that that is part of how these set prayers and these prayers from different liturgies can help us out. It's like tracing for our prayer life, tracing and training our heart after something um, that is more close to how we want to approach God. Not that our prayers on their own and our heart on its own doesn't follow God, but I think that we can be trained in prayer and our heart can be trained and formed. Um, so just this idea of, it's a way for us to trace and learn more how to pray. So yeah, with that, just invite you all to continue with us. And, the purpose of this is to experience the Lord's Prayer and not just have a series of 6 weeks where we teach you and then you go about your weeks. So yeah, please join us in that. Um, so focusing on the Lord's Prayer and the passage for today, I was doing some research on the Lord's Prayer, and in the passage in Matthew, he's contrasting it with the prayer of the pagans. And so I had an example, Mike, if you can pull it up. It's kind of an interesting excerpt from around that time of a prayer to the Greek gods. And so it's under Diana's protection, we pure girls and boys, such and such, O daughter of Latona, greatest child of Jove, and on and on. And so you have this culture where there's many gods, and you're addressing all of them, and you're kind of appeasing them. And so, in contrast to that, Jesus said, they think that they'll get heard because of their many words, but what Jesus is really pointing at is their conception of gods was, there's gods for all different aspects of our lives, and they're unpredictable. And so you need to, pray a certain way to win them over. It's kind of your way of controlling your destiny by saying the prayers and going on and trying to get on the good side of the gods. But Jesus was saying, that's not how our Father is. Our Father is very predictable, and we know that He cares for us. And so, in contrast to a long-winded prayer, we have this kind of direct address where we can just come to our Father and know and trust that He will provide for us. And then another prayer from that time is the Kaddish. And this is one that has very similar wording to the Lord's Prayer. And so people have pointed to this and, kind of thought that Jesus was using this, kind of framing his prayer from this. But again, it was another prayer that would be said throughout your day. So magnified and sanctified be his great name in the world, which he created according to his will. And may he establish his kingdom during your life and during your days and during the life of all the houses of Israel, speedily and in the near future, and say amen. And there's a couple other lines that go with that. And so you can definitely see that Jesus was mirroring the language of this prayer. But one aspect of the Lord's Prayer that's not really reflected in this and is really a central part of his teaching, again in the Sermon on the Mount and then his other teachings given in the Gospels, is the dimension that not only are we looking at and honoring God, but we're trying to love other people, and the greatest command, love God, love others. And so he adds this aspect of, forgive us our sins as we also forgive others. And so you have both dimensions reflected in Jesus' prayer. And so what makes this prayer distinct? I think it's been interpreted and thought of in a lot of different ways. But there's aspects of it that people will point to and say, this is the perfect prayer. It's so true. It's so beautiful that it is above all other prayers and kind of the chief prayer. And there's certainly truth to this being a very, very important prayer. But I don't think that the Lord's Prayer is all encompassing of prayer. And there are many other aspects that you see in the Psalms. Jesus prays other prayers in the Gospels. And so I don't think that it's meant to be, the perfect prayer. Say this prayer if you want to say the right prayer. And also, that this prayer would serve as a model. Certainly there's very important components of it, but again, I think that if you look at all of the prayers reflected in the Bible, there's more aspects to our prayer life than what is reflected in here. I think what really makes the Lord's Prayer distinct is this is the Jesus followers prayer. And you see in Luke that the disciples approached Jesus and they said, John's disciples, he taught them to pray, teach us to pray. And so this is Jesus with his followers teaching them how they should pray. And their saying of this prayer is part of what makes them distinct as a community. It marks them as Jesus followers to say this prayer. And then you see that beyond Jesus' life and in the early teachings of the church within the first century, they established this practice. Okay, 3 times a day, we're going to say the Lord's Prayer. And even the language of, say this whenever you pray. And so it's a prayer that marks us as a community of Jesus followers. And that's the orientation of us. And then ultimately, I'd like us to think about it as not just what we're supposed to do, but again, Jesus is teaching his followers, and he's giving this prayer, he's giving these teachings for their benefit. So this is a gift to us to benefit us. And not only for our lives, but his teachings and this prayer are something that has a ripple effect, where as we follow them, we see flourishing in our lives, and we see flourishing in the lives around us. So let's look at the first part of the prayer. So Aiden/Craig taught on the first part, which was wonderful. But yeah, it starts off, Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And right away, I see a sandwich. So the first line, Our Father who art in heaven, and then the last line, on earth as it is in heaven. And so what's in the middle of the sandwich? Your kingdom come. And that phrase, kingdom, is packed with a lot of different meanings, but I think it's central to this first passage of the prayer. And so I want to unpack that a little bit. And again, it's a little bit like the Trinity, trying to think through, what is heaven, what is earth. It's kind of a mind-bending concept. But as I was thinking on that and learning on that, I think it's two overlapping worlds, two overlapping realms. And so you have, of course, God's kingdom and his rule. And what I would say is within that you have the world and the dominion that he has given over to us humans. And he allows humans to have dominion within that world, but again, like it's talked about as a separation, but how is it separated? How are these two different? It's really a matter of God's character and who he is. So he, as we know, is all over and everywhere. And so the idea that God is not present here, we understand that he is, throughout our world. And so I think that separation is a matter of will. Like, you have the will of man, and then you have the will of God. And these two clash. And God, of course, allows that. But the primary tension is in these two different wills. And the biblical story follows that and illustrates what those two different worlds look like. And so in the first story in the garden, God creates this wonderful world and this place where man can thrive, and he allows man to have a job. And so he's gardening, he's taking care of things, and his will is that he does those things, he carries that out for him, but he also says, don't eat of the tree. And of course, Adam and Eve choose to eat from the tree because, again, they have their own will. And so you kind of have this rupturing where all of a sudden what was, a happy coexistence, God, you gave us this world and this role, and suddenly that's ruptured. And throughout the covenants and the laws and the prophets, God is again trying to, this tension of he's trying to influence and enforce his will, but he is not taking over in a way that he is taking away man's ability to make their own decisions. Another way to think about it is, our idea of angels and, these spiritual beings that are united with God. So they serve God, and there isn't that same tension of God's will and their will. They're united and can easily work together. But here on earth and in our world, we still have this tension. We still want to control and follow our own hearts and think in a lot of ways that we know best. So, onto the scene, Jesus comes along, and he basically gives us the example of, what it looks like to follow God's will as a human, as a human being. And it looks a lot of different ways. He does miracles. He heals people, he drives out demons, um, but he primarily does this in his personal surrender to following God. And um, Jesus essentially grew up, or not grew up. He lived a life as a homeless, itinerant preacher. Um, and if anyone could have reached for and obtained, power and influence, it would have been him. Um, but it's really not the way of the kingdom or God's heart. And so, we see him ultimately surrendering, um, in the garden to God's will, through to the very end. Um, and so I think that, like, what's fascinating about Jesus is not that he was really powerful, but he was so, like, grounded and, um, of the world, but still transcendent and beyond it. It was just such a kind of a normal life, and filled with, all kinds of challenges, but really ultimately demonstrating, what it means um, to follow God's will while being in this earth that has been corrupted and is essentially governed outside of God's will, but according to God's will. Anyway. Um, and the final thing with the kingdom is, what you see after Jesus' death and his resurrection, uh, is the Spirit comes and you have this, like, incredible spreading of um, Jesus' teachings, Jesus' followers, um, and so really the primary avenue for, God's kingdom becomes the church. The church is structured, one established by Jesus, but also structured um, to to be a real reflection of God's kingdom on earth. And so um, we as a church, as Grassroots, have, like, a very special role within God's kingdom. This is where it's intended that rather than being a people who just follow our own way, we are a people who value and cherish God's will and also follow Him. Um, and of course, there's this um, challenge of the now and the not yet. So we see that Jesus accomplished, everything for us and essentially brought about, resolution ultimately to sin and death. But we're still in this world. God's still allowing um, man to have dominion and will here, and so we're um, forced to wait and to trust, and to ultimately look to Him to be our guide. Um, and I think one of the best resources to live in the now and the not yet, and again, going back to our series on the Psalms, Psalm 23, and I love this psalm. I have a handful of psalms that I just think of as, like, the super psalms. Like, this is something that every time I go to it, I feel encouraged and refreshed. But in the CSB, it reads, "The Lord is my shepherd. I have what I need. He lets me lie down in green pasture. He leads me beside quiet waters. He renews my life. He leads me along the right path for his name's sake. Even when I go through the darkest valley, I fear no danger, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. And so we just see like a very simple trust. Um, and, you know, our model is to be sheep with a shepherd, and um, to be able to trust God through challenges and difficulties, um, and to adapt not only a perspective and a view that's based on our like the wider culture, and how they see the world, but to have eyes to see how God is in the world. So the last line, only goodness and faithful love will pursue me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord as long as I live. So, yeah, that God would just awaken our eyes to be aware of how He is close to us, to how we can depend on Him, and yeah, see the way that He works despite kind of our short-sighted, you know, what's in front of our eyes in our lives. Yeah, and I think for us as a church and what we see modeled in Jesus is a life of surrender. Again, we want our own ways, and I want my own way, but I think God calls us to surrender, and I think that can feel like a very big ask and kind of abstract. But God works in ways that magnify what we give Him. So even the smallest part of our heart that we surrender for Him, He'll do a lot with that. So He meets us where we're at, and just asks us to kind of look at and um, surrender to Him um, as we can. And so I would encourage you all, as you're reading the Lord's Prayer, to um, yeah, to surrender to His will and His way. Not that we lose ourselves completely in that, but that we actually become more human in that surrender. So let's pray.